You know that moment when everything you thought you understood about your own family suddenly flips upside down in one single breath. That is exactly where my story starts. I had driven up to this luxury mountain retreat near Missoula, thinking we were finally going to talk like adults about the company my grandfather built. Instead, the first hour turned into pure chaos, and I realized my older brother had been playing a game I never even knew existed. My name is Victoria Palmer. I am 34 years old. I have spent the last 8 years quietly keeping our family's outdoor gear and apparel company alive, while the rest of them smiled for the cameras and spent the profits. We were supposed to be at this private lodge for a weekend of family strategy and healing. The place sat high on a ridge with floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over pine-covered mountains and a cold, fast river below. It cost more per night than most people make in a month, but my father had insisted it was necessary. He said we needed neutral ground away from the office to finally settle things. I should have known better the second I saw my older brother Douglas standing at the head of the long wooden table when I walked into the main room. He was already pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter like he owned the place. My father Howard sat to his right, nodding along to whatever Douglas was saying. My mother Frances was on the left, staring at her phone and pretending none of this concerned her. 2 other people were there too. Gregory Stone, our longtime external accountant who had flown in from Seattle, looked uncomfortable in his casual sweater. Pamela Cross, a senior compliance officer from the bank that handled most of our accounts, sat quietly at the far end with a thick folder in front of her. I had not expected either of them. That should have been my first warning. Douglas looked up when I entered and gave me that same tight smile he had used since we were kids whenever he wanted something from me. Victoria. Good. You are here. We were just getting started without you. I set my bag down and took the only seat left, the one farthest from the fire. The room already felt too warm. I thought the meeting started at 10. It is 9:45. He waved a hand like the detail did not matter. We are family. We do not need to stand on ceremony. Besides, some of us have been up since dawn, working on real solutions. My father nodded, like Douglas had just said something profound. Your brother has some strong ideas about moving the company forward. We need to hear him out. I kept my voice even. I have been moving the company forward for 8 years, while the rest of you were busy with other things. I would like to hear what these strong ideas actually are before anyone agrees to anything. That was when the first crack appeared. Douglas leaned forward, elbows on the table, and started talking about streamlining operations and removing dead weight from the leadership structure. He never said my name, but every sentence pointed straight at me. He wanted to bring in outside investors who would take a controlling stake. He wanted to restructure the board so that only people with recent operational experience could hold voting shares. He wanted to move key accounts to a new bank that apparently offered better terms. Every change he proposed would quietly cut my influence to almost nothing while giving him and my father more control. I felt the familiar cold anger start to rise in my chest, the same feeling I had learned to swallow for years. I had been the one negotiating with suppliers when payments were late. I had been the one flying out to fix production problems in the middle of the night. I had signed the personal guarantees on the loans when the banks got nervous. And now, my older brother was sitting here in a $4,000 sweater, talking about dead weight like I had not kept the lights on. My father cleared his throat and looked at me with that tired, disappointed expression he always wore when I pushed back. Victoria, you have done a lot. No one is saying you have not worked hard. But Douglas has a point about fresh perspective. The company cannot keep running on one person's shoulders forever. I turned to him, One person's shoulders I have been carrying this entire thing while you and Douglas were out on the golf course or at whatever conference sounded good that week. If you want fresh perspective, fine. But do not pretend this is about the good of the company when it is really about who gets to sign the checks. Douglas laughed short and sharp. There it is. The victim act again. You always make it sound like you are the only one who cares. Meanwhile, the rest of us are trying to keep this from turning into a complete disaster because you refuse to let go of control. The room went quiet, except for the crackle of the fire. Gregory Stone shifted in his chair and looked down at his notes. Pamela Cross watched all of us without saying a word, her fingers resting on that closed folder. My mother finally looked up from her phone long enough to sigh, like we were all being dramatic children. I kept my hands flat on the table so no one could see them shaking. If you think I am the problem, then say it plainly. Do not hide behind words like streamlining and fresh perspective. Tell me what you actually want. Douglas met my eyes without flinching. I want you to step back. Let the people who understand modern business run the day-to-day. You can keep a small equity stake and a consulting role if you want, but the decisions need to be made by people who are not emotionally attached to every single detail. My father nodded again. Slower this time. It might be for the best, Victoria. You have been under a lot of stress. Maybe this is a chance for you to focus on other things. I felt something inside me shift, like a gear grinding the wrong way. For years I had told myself that my father was just weak, that he went along with Douglas because it was easier than fighting. I had told myself that if I just kept proving my value, eventually he would see it. Sitting there in that expensive lodge with the mountains outside and my own family looking at me like I was the obstacle, I realized I had been lying to myself the entire time. The conversation spiraled from there. Douglas kept pushing. My father kept agreeing. My mother kept checking her phone. Gregory tried once or twice to bring up actual numbers, but got talked over. Pamela Cross stayed silent, though I noticed her writing things down. The longer it went on, the more chaotic everything felt. Voices rose, accusations flew. Douglas accused me of hoarding information. My father accused me of being difficult on purpose. I accused them both of trying to steal what I had built while they were busy spending. None of it was calm. None of it was strategic. It was raw and ugly and happening too fast for me to control. At some point, Douglas stood up and walked over to the side table where someone had left a stack of printed reports. He picked up one of the folders and tossed it in front of me. Look at the numbers yourself if you do not believe me. The company is losing ground because we are too slow to adapt. These are the projections if we keep doing things your way. I opened the folder. The pages inside were clean professional, full of charts and bullet points, but something about them felt off. The dates were recent, yet some of the account numbers in the footnotes did not match anything I recognized from our regular statements. I flipped through more slowly, my eyes catching on small inconsistencies. One page listed a transfer to an account I had never seen. Another showed a consulting fee paid to a name that did not exist in any of our vendor files. I looked up at Douglas. He was watching me with that same tight smile. See, even the numbers agree with me. I closed the folder without saying anything. The room was still loud around me, my father and Douglas talking over each other, now my mother telling them both to lower their voices. But inside my head, everything had gone very quiet and very cold. I had spent years trusting that even if they did not appreciate me, at least they were not actively working against me. The papers in front of me suggested otherwise. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me. I need some air, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. We can continue this after lunch. No one tried to stop me. Douglas just shrugged like it did not matter whether I stayed or left. My father looked relieved. My mother had already gone back to her phone. Gregory gave me a small, worried nod. Pamela Cross met my eyes for a second and then looked back down at her folder. I walked out onto the wide deck that wrapped around the lodge. The mountain air was sharp and cold even in early summer. Below me, the river moved fast between the rocks. I leaned on the railing and tried to slow my breathing. My hands were still shaking. Something was wrong with those reports. I knew our numbers. I knew our accounts. Those extra transfers and that unknown consulting name did not belong there. Either Douglas had made a mistake in his presentation, or he had been moving things around without telling anyone. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure app we use for company documents. I searched for the account numbers I had seen in the footnotes. Nothing came up in our main system. That should not have been possible. I was still staring at the screen when I heard the door open behind me. I turned, expecting Douglas or my father. Instead, it was Gregory Stone. He stepped out and closed the door quietly behind him. "Victoria," he said, keeping his voice low. "I did not want to say anything in there, but those numbers he showed you, they do not match the statements I prepared last month. Some of the transfers look like they went through accounts we closed 2 years ago." I felt the ground tilt a little under my feet. "You are sure?" He nodded. "I can pull the real statements if you want. But I think someone has been editing the versions that get shown to the family." I looked back out at the mountains. The wind was picking up, pushing clouds across the peaks. Inside the lodge, my older brother and my father were still sitting at that table, still talking about how I was the problem. They had no idea I was standing out here, realizing that the problem might be much bigger and much quieter than any of us had admitted. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. "Gregory, I need you to do something for me." Quietly, he waited. "I need the real statements for the last 6 months. All of them. And I need to know who has access to move money without a second signature." He hesitated for only a second. Then he nodded again. "I can have them to you by tonight." "But Victoria, if what I am seeing is real, this is not just family disagreement anymore." I did not answer. I just watched the river moving fast and cold below us. The weekend that was supposed to bring us together had already started to tear something open, and I had the sudden unstable feeling that none of us were going to walk away from this lodge the same way we had arrived. Later that evening, after the afternoon had dissolved into more circular arguments, and my older brother Douglas had finally left the main room to take a call, I went back to my suite on the upper floor of the lodge. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the heating system and the occasional gust of wind against the windows. I had not eaten much at lunch. My stomach felt tight and unsteady, like the ground under my feet was still shifting from everything that had been said downstairs. I closed the door behind me and locked it. Then I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my laptop. Gregory had sent the files exactly as he promised, encrypted and labeled only with dates. I downloaded them and started reading. The first few pages looked normal. Our usual operating expenses, supplier payments, payroll. But as I kept scrolling, the numbers began to diverge from what I knew by heart. There were transfers I had never authorized, large ones. They went to accounts that did not appear in any of our official records. One was labeled simply as Consulting Services Q3. The amount was written out as $180,000. Another 2 months later was listed as Market Research, International. That one was $240,000. Both had been moved through a routing number I did not recognize. I cross-checked the dates against our internal calendar. On the days those transfers happened, I had been in meetings or traveling for supplier negotiations. Douglas had been the only one with full access during those windows. My father had been on vacation both times. My hands felt cold. I kept reading. The pattern was quiet and consistent, small enough amounts that they might slip past casual review, but frequent enough to add up to real money over months. There was no paper trail of board approval, no second signature, just clean, silent movement from our main accounts into places I could not see. I opened another file Gregory had included. This one was a printout of recent phone logs from the company line Douglas used most often. The calls were logged with times and durations. Most were to known contacts, but 3 numbers repeated across different days. I searched one of them quickly on a separate browser. It came back registered to a shell company in another state, the kind of entity that existed only on paper. The call durations were long, 10 minutes, 20, sometimes longer. Enough time to discuss details. I sat back in the chair. The screen glowed in the darkening room. Outside the window, the mountains had turned deep blue, and the river was just a darker line moving through the valley. Inside my head, everything felt loud and chaotic at once. My older brother had been moving money out of the company we both inherited. He had done it quietly while I was the one staying late and fixing problems. My father had either known or chosen not to know. Either way, he had stood beside Douglas that morning and called me the problem. I picked up my phone and texted Gregory, one word confirmed. He replied almost immediately, "I can bring the full packet to your room if you want." Pamela Cross asked me quietly if everything was all right. She said the bank has been seeing unusual activity on the accounts for weeks, but no one from the family would return her calls. I stared at the message. Pamela Cross was the compliance officer who had sat at the table that morning saying almost nothing. She had come because the bank was concerned, and no one had told me. A knock came at the door. I closed the laptop and stood up. When I opened it, Gregory was standing there holding a thin black folder. He glanced down the hallway once before stepping inside. I printed the clean versions, he said, keeping his voice low, the ones that match what the bank actually has. And I highlighted the transfers that do not have authorization on file. I took the folder. "Thank you. Did anyone see you come up here? Douglas is still on the phone downstairs. Your father went for a walk. Your mother is in the spa. Pamela is in her room reviewing something. I think we are clear for a few minutes." I opened the folder on the desk. The pages inside were crisp and clear. Every suspicious transfer was marked in yellow. The amounts were written out in full. There was no ambiguity. This was not a mistake. This was a pattern. Gregory stayed near the door. "Victoria, I have worked with your family for 12 years. I have never seen anything like this. If these numbers are real, and I believe they are, then someone has been building a private fund outside the company books. The kind of fund that does not show up on tax filings or board reports." I kept my eyes on the pages. My older brother, he did not argue. The call logs line up with the transfer dates. The shell company that received the money has no public contracts with us. It exists to receive and move funds. That is all it does. I closed the folder slowly. The paper felt heavy in my hands. For years, I had told myself that even if my father and my older brother did not value what I did, they would not actively work to take it from me. The evidence in front of me said otherwise. Douglas had been building something on the side while I kept the lights on. My father had let it happen. "I need to talk to Pamela Cross," I said, "alone. Can you ask her to come up here without making it obvious?" Gregory nodded. "I will text her." She seemed like she wanted to say more this morning, but could not in front of everyone. He left quietly. I sat back down at the desk and opened the folder again. The numbers stared back at me. $180,000, $240,000, smaller amounts scattered across other months. All of it moved without my knowledge, without my signature, while I was the one the banks called when payments were late. The knock came 15 minutes later. I opened the door. Pamela Cross stood there in the same dark sweater she had worn at the meeting. She carried her own folder thicker than the one Gregory had brought. "Gregory said you wanted to see me," she said. Her voice was calm but tired. "I was hoping we could talk privately before tomorrow's session." I stepped aside and let her in. She closed the door behind her. "I have been trying to reach someone in your family for 3 weeks," she said. The bank flagged several large outgoing wires that did not match your usual patterns. When no one returned my calls, I asked to be included in this weekend. I needed answers in person. She opened her folder and laid out several pages on the desk next to mine. They were bank statements with the same transfers highlighted. The amounts matched what Gregory had shown me. The receiving accounts were the same shell entities. Pamela looked at me directly. "These are not errors, Victoria. Someone with authorized access has been moving money out of the operating accounts into entities that have no legitimate business with your company. The phone records we pulled show repeated contact with at least one of those entities. I cannot say who made the calls without a formal request, but the pattern is clear." I felt the room tilt again. The evidence was no longer just in my head or in Gregory's files. It was sitting on the desk in black and white, confirmed by the bank itself. "Does my father know I asked?" Pamela hesitated. "I spoke with him briefly this afternoon. He said the transfers were for strategic opportunities that Douglas was handling. He asked me not to discuss it further until the family had time to review." My father had known, or at least he had chosen to believe whatever my older brother told him. Either way, he had not told me. I sat down slowly. The chair felt unsteady under me. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. Pine branches scraped against the glass. Inside the lodge, my family was still moving through the evening. Like nothing fundamental had changed. My mother was probably getting a massage. My father was probably having a drink by the fire. Douglas was probably still on that phone call, moving more pieces, while the rest of us pretended this was still just a disagreement about leadership. Pamela gathered her papers. "I am required to report this if it continues. The bank has compliance obligations, but I wanted to give your family a chance to address it internally first. That is why I am here." She left the folder on the desk. "These are copies. The originals are at the bank. If you need anything else, you have my number." After she was gone, I stayed at the desk for a long time. The 2 folders sat side by side, one from Gregory, one from the bank. Both said the same thing in different words. My older brother had been building a private slush fund using company money. My father had either helped or looked the other way. I had been the last to know. I stood up and walked to the window. The mountains were black now against the night sky. The river was invisible. I could hear voices from downstairs faint through the floor. Someone laughed. It sounded like Douglas. The feeling in my chest was no longer just anger. It was something more unstable. The ground I had stood on for years had been quietly moved while I was working. Now I was standing on air, and the only thing keeping me from falling was what I decided to do next. I picked up my phone and opened the encrypted message thread with Gregory. I typed 3 words: "We need to talk." Then I added one more line: "Bring everything you have." I hit send and set the phone down. The screen went dark. Outside, the wind kept moving through the trees. Inside the lodge, my family kept moving through their evening. And I stood at the window, knowing that by morning, the quiet betrayal I had just uncovered would no longer be quiet. The message to Gregory went through. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the highlighted numbers on those pages and heard my father's voice from earlier telling me I was the problem. By morning, the wind had calmed, but the air inside the lodge felt heavier than ever. We gathered again in the main room after breakfast. The long wooden table was the same. The mountain view outside the windows was the same. Everything else had changed. Gregory sat to my left with his own copies of the statements. Pamela Cross sat across from me, her folder open. My father, Howard, took the head of the table again. My older brother, Douglas, sat beside him, looking relaxed, like this was still just another family discussion. My mother, Frances, sat at the far end, already checking her phone. I placed the printed statements and the phone log printout in the center of the table. "These are the real numbers," I said. My voice stayed calm even though my chest felt tight and unsteady. "Not the edited versions my older brother showed us yesterday. These are what the bank actually has on file." Douglas glanced at the pages and gave a short laugh. "You really brought homework to a family meeting, Victoria. This is getting embarrassing." I ignored him and looked at my father. "The transfers started 6 months ago. They went to accounts that do not exist in any of our official records. $180,000 here, $240,000 there. All moved while I was traveling or in meetings. Only one person had uninterrupted access during those windows." My father shifted in his chair. He did not look at the papers. Douglas explained those were for strategic opportunities, new markets. "We do not need to turn this into an accusation." Pamela Cross spoke before I could answer. Her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of someone who had done this before. "I am the compliance officer from your primary bank. Those transfers triggered our monitoring system because they did not match any documented vendor or project. When I tried to reach the authorized signers, no one returned my calls. That is why I am here this weekend. The bank is required to investigate further if the activity continues." The room went still for a moment. Then my older brother pushed his chair back and stood up. "This is ridiculous. You are both acting like I committed some crime. Those were legitimate business expenses. Victoria has always been paranoid about control. She cannot stand the idea that someone else might have a better plan for the company." I stayed seated, then explained the shell company that received the money. Explain why the phone logs show repeated calls to that same number on the exact days the transfers cleared. Explain why none of this appears in any board minutes or tax filings. Douglas's face changed. The easy arrogance slipped for a second. "You went through my call logs. That is private." Gregory answered this time. "The logs are from the company line. Everything on that line is company property. I pulled them after you showed us numbers that did not match our actual books. The discrepancies are not small, Douglas. They add up to more than $700,000 over 6 months." My father finally looked at the papers. His hand stayed flat on the table. "Even if some of this is true, we can handle it internally. We do not need outsiders involved. This is still a family company." Pamela Cross closed her folder. "That decision may no longer be yours to make. Once unauthorized transfers of this size are documented, the bank has an obligation to freeze the affected accounts pending review. I have already prepared the internal report. It will be filed by end of day, unless the family can provide clear documentation that these were approved and legitimate." The chaos I had felt building since yesterday morning finally broke open. My older brother started shouting about betrayal and how I had always been jealous of his vision. My father kept repeating that we could fix this quietly, that involving the bank would destroy everything. My mother finally looked up from her phone and said the family was falling apart because I could not let things go. Gregory tried to interject with actual numbers and got talked over. Pamela Cross sat back and let the noise happen, her expression unchanged. I waited until the voices started to overlap and repeat. Then I stood up. The movement made everyone stop. "I am not fighting you for control of the company," I said. My voice felt distant, even to me. "I built most of what exists today, while the rest of you were busy elsewhere. I signed the guarantees when the banks got nervous. I fixed the problems no one else wanted to touch. And while I was doing that, my older brother was quietly moving money into accounts only he could access. My father knew enough to defend him anyway." I looked at my father directly. You chose him. Again, just like you always have. I am done asking you to see what is right in front of you. My older brother crossed his arms. So what, you are going to run to the lawyers now? Make this public. That will kill the company, and you know it. I shook my head. No, I am choosing to walk away. I have already spoken with our corporate counsel this morning. The unauthorized transfers give me grounds to request a full forensic audit. The bank will freeze the accounts either way. If you want to keep fighting over what is left, you can do it without me. I am transferring my remaining shares into a trust that requires independent oversight. The company can survive or it can collapse under the weight of what you have done. Either way, I will not be here to watch. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not shock. It was the sound of something breaking that could not be fixed. My father stood up slowly. Victoria, you cannot just leave. This is your family. We can work this out. I picked up my bag from beside the chair. We already worked it out. You made your choice. I am making mine. I walked out of the room without looking back. Gregory followed me a minute later with the folders. Pamela Cross stayed at the table, already on her phone with the bank. My older brother and my father stayed behind, their voices rising again as soon as the door closed. I drove down the mountain road alone. The pine trees blurred past the windows. My hands were steady on the wheel, even though my chest still felt tight and unsteady. I had spent years believing that if I just worked harder and stayed quiet, my family would eventually value what I brought. The evidence I left on that table proved otherwise. My older brother had stolen from the company we both inherited. My father had protected him. My mother had looked the other way. I could not change any of that. I could only stop letting it cost me pieces of myself. 2 weeks later, the bank completed its initial review. The accounts were frozen, pending a full investigation. The forensic audit my lawyer requested turned up more transfers than I had found on my own. My older brother tried to spin it as a misunderstanding in a statement to the board, but the documentation was too clear. He resigned 2 days after the audit report landed. My father called me once after that. He said he was sorry things had gone this far and asked if I would come back to help stabilize the company. I told him no. I told him the only stability I was interested in was the one I built for myself without them. I sold my remaining shares at a loss. The money went into the trust along with the rest of what I had protected. The company survived in a smaller form, under new leadership and outside oversight. My older brother and my father lost the control they had tried to take. In the end, the fortune did not go to any of us the way they planned. It got redirected quietly through legal channels and bank requirements until almost nothing was left to fight over. That was the ironic part. They had torn everything apart trying to keep it, and in the end, there was less for everyone. I moved to a smaller city, 2 states away, and started over with the skills I had spent years proving I had. Gregory stayed in touch. He helped me set up the new structure for the trust and introduced me to people who actually valued clear numbers over family loyalty. Pamela Cross sent a short note after the investigation closed. She said she was sorry it had come to that, but glad someone had finally been willing to look at the facts. I kept both messages. They were the only pieces of that weekend I chose to keep. Some nights I still feel the instability of standing in that lodge room with the evidence on the table and my father choosing my older brother anyway. The pain does not disappear just because I made the right choice, but it no longer owns me. I learned that sometimes the only way to stop a toxic pattern is to break it yourself, even when it means walking away from people who are supposed to protect you. Chosen family does not have to share your blood. It only has to show up when it matters and tell the truth when it is hard. I still think about that question I asked myself on the deck that first afternoon. How far is too far? For me, the answer was simple once I saw the numbers. Stealing from the company while I carried it was already too far. Defending the person who did it was even farther. I do not regret drawing the line. I only regret how long it took me to see where it needed to be drawn. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of it sounded familiar, I hope it gives you the clarity to ask the same question for yourself. What would you do if the people who were supposed to have your back turned out to be the ones quietly taking from you